Welcome, everybody, to the Jay Heritage Center's conversation with author and historian Tom Ricks. I'm Kevin Peraino. I'm the executive director of the Jay Heritage Center, and I know a lot of you have been to the Jay Heritage Center and some of you haven't. If you haven't, come and stop by. The grounds are open. We are a beautiful 23-acre historic site on the shore of Long Island Sound in Rye, New York. We were once the home of John Jay, the founding father, and these days we're an education center. We do programs in history, social justice, environmental stewardship, and other things. And this event tonight is a particular treat for us because if you come visit us, the influence of the Greeks and Romans on the founding fathers is particularly evident. The centerpiece of our site is an 1838 Greek Revival mansion that's full of classical motifs throughout the thing. And if you look at, through research, if you look at John Jay's letters, he writes about coming to this property and reading the classics right here. So this is a topic that's close to our hearts. We're lucky tonight to have Tom Ricks with us tonight. His background is in journalism. He spent 25 years at the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal, writing about the US military, reported from places like Somalia and Haiti and Afghanistan and Iraq. I don't know, frankly, where he puts all his Pulitzer Prizes. He was a member of a team that won 2 Pulitzer Prizes for journalism, and his book Fiasco about the Iraq War was a finalist for the Pulitzer, as well as being a #1 New York Times bestseller. So we're thrilled to have him here today. He's written too many books to mention, or we'd eat up all our time talking about them, but two works of history that he's written are The Generals, American Military Command from World War II to today, and Churchill and Orwell, The Fight for Freedom. His latest book that we're going to talk about tonight is a huge bestseller. It's called First Principles: What America's Founders Learned from the Greeks and Romans and How That Shaped Our Country. So welcome, Tom.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Tom is coming to us from Maine tonight, and we're going to talk for maybe 30 minutes or so, Tom and I, and then we'll stop about halfway through. And we'll take questions. I know we will get questions tonight because we did your book as a book club selection. So a lot of the people who are watching tonight have read the book, which is great. I'll remind people that you can ask questions at any time during the thing. There's a little bubble at the bottom of the screen that says Q&A. You can click on it and type your questions in there. You don't have to wait till we're halfway through. You can do it. You can type them at any time, and then we'll get to them when we get to questions. So maybe I would start by asking, Tom, you're obviously the kind of stuff that you've written. You're a polymath. You've written a little bit about everything, but how did you get onto this topic, and what was it about the founders that drew you to this topic?
A lot of books, you have no idea where it came from. It just kind of showed up one day. This book is the opposite. This book, I can tell you the time, the place, the moment. It was in the house I'm speaking from now, our little house on an island off the coast of Maine. It was the Wednesday after the presidential election of 2016. I woke up and I thought, I don't understand what just happened in this country. I don't understand what the millions of people who just voted for Donald Trump think that a president should be, what their understanding of the presidency is, what their understanding of the country is. And so I went downstairs to my library and I took off the shelf my old battered college copy of Aristotle's Politics. And I took it down and reread it in the context of Trump having just been elected president. And it was really interesting to me because suddenly Aristotle starts making different sense. At one point, something that I hadn't paid attention to in college, Aristotle goes through the different types of government. He talks about aristocracy, monarchy, and democracy. In each of these, he says degenerates. Democracy degenerates into the mob, aristocracy degenerates into oligarchy, and monarchy into tyranny. And he says, in an interesting moment, he says, an oligarchy is the least stable form of government. And that put a light on for me. Oh, let's think about Donald Trump in the context that Aristotle presents. Is Trump going to be an unstable presidency? And I think it was. And so that started me unexpectedly on several years of rereading ancient Greek and Roman history, philosophy, and literature in the context of America today. What led me first from Aristotle to other Greeks, and then from the Greeks to the Romans, was the realization that, oh, this is also the stuff that educated the founding fathers of America, that the revolutionary generation was raised on this stuff. This was their political vocabulary. This was really, when they talked about politics, they tended to talk in terms of Rome, Roman history, and especially the decline of the Roman Republic. And so that's what eventually led to this book.
Gotcha. In the book, I thought, and correct me if I'm wrong, if this is not your intention, but it seemed like Madison came off pretty well. John Adams and Jefferson, not as well. I'm wondering, as you're researching the book, you always come, when you're writing a book, you always come to it with preconceptions of what you think about, certain characters, certain figures. I'm wondering, throughout the course of researching this book, what elements of the history did you find turned on their head, that you found that you were surprised about, and that you learned something about the founders that you didn't realize?
Well, that was a good summary. I would say the two heroes of the book are George Washington and James Madison. There's a saying among American historians, the more you know about George Washington, the more you admire him. And I think the same is true for me of James Madison. I was not a big Madison fan going into the book. And again, I find Madison playing this key strategic role of seeing what the situation is and devising a response to it. I think that Madison doesn't get quite the appreciation he should because he's not a memorable writer. There's not one phrase we associate with Madison in a way that you can point to something that Washington did or said or Jefferson did or said. Madison is kind of in the background. He's a master politician, but he's the guy who really, I think, after Washington, is the second most important founder. Washington won the country. If another general had led the American army during the Revolution, I don't think we would have won the war. Washington puts his imprint on the country. Madison comes right after that. Madison designs the country. In the Constitution, in getting the Constitution ratified with the Federalist Papers, and later in alliance with Thomas Jefferson, in bringing together the first political party in the country. So that was one big surprise to me, was the emergence of Madison. The second big surprise to me was just in terms of research. The digitization of American history stunned me. And this was not true in my previous books. Partly my previous book was more British history, Churchill and Orwell. And the book before that was about American generalship in World War II to the present. The surprise to me was every single word published, printed, and written in the 18th century is now online and searchable. And it instantly enabled me to test assertions made by famous American historians. It felt a little unfair. Some guy, Carl Degler, famous American historian in the 20th century, asserts that Locke is the single most important influence on the founding generation, John Locke, the English philosopher. And I said, well, that's interesting. Let's see how often the founders refer to Locke versus how often they refer to Montesquieu. Well, they refer to Montesquieu twice as often. Why is that? And you realize I could check all this stuff instantly using Founders Online, a wonderful website, and a couple of proprietary databases like early American imprints. Every single word that the founders wrote is searchable. Every single word that appeared in a pamphlet or a newspaper or a book in America in the 18th century is online and searchable. One of the stunning moments to me was I was reading a textbook that John Adams, I knew, had used as a teacher in Worcester, Massachusetts, as a young, disgruntled Harvard graduate. And I thought, well, I was sort of reading through the online version, and at the end, I stopped to get the bibliographical information for the footnote. And I looked at the front of the book and found the copy I'd been using online was John Adams' personal copy.
Oh, wow. Amazing.
I didn't know that until I'd finished, but it was just amazing to me. It was what's it, Dodsley's Preceptor, which is a great textbook of the 18th century on what an educated young man should know.
Incredible, incredible. Let me ask a little bit about Washington too. Washington he was kind of unusual in terms of the founders in that he didn't speak Latin. He wasn't as well read in the classics as some of the other founders. But you point out that he embodied classical virtues.
One of my favorite moments in the book is a conversation that John Adams is having with Pickering, who was Postmaster General when John Adams was vice president. They're having drinks one night in Philadelphia, and they get into an argument about whether George Washington actually is illiterate. And Pickering says, no, he really can't write. And John Adams says, no, when I was in Congress during the war, we used to get wonderful letters from General Washington describing the war effort. And Pickering goes, nah, those were all written by that kid Hamilton. Hamilton's a really good writer. He would basically take what Washington told him and he'd write it up in a good letter. But as you say, the fascinating aspect of Washington is, even though he was relatively uneducated, never learned a foreign language, never traveled to Europe as as Jefferson and Adams did, he really came to embody the classicism of the revolutionary generation. And I think this is partly because, like a lot of people who are intelligent but not well educated, he became very perceptive in learning from experience. And Washington knew he was not well educated, knew he could not write well. So all his life found people who could help him with that. And he also became very perceptive in what it took to rise in his society. And he saw that there was this classical world that he wasn't really attuned to, but he learned to imitate. He actually takes as his model Cato, a Roman statesman known for his prudence, his wisdom, his reserve, and his frugality. And these are things that you see Washington imitate all his life, especially restraint. Washington has a volcanic temper as a young man. He learns to control it generally, loses it a couple of times in the Revolution, loses it once in a cabinet meeting. But Washington becomes the American Cato. And this is a figure really well known to them in a way that we don't perceive today. They didn't have movie stars. They didn't have athletic heroes. They didn't have pop stars. What they had basically was historical figures for their role models. And Washington takes Cato to people of his time know who Cato is. One of the most popular plays of the 18th century was Cato. And the story is, it's not quite confirmed, but the story is that Washington had it put on at Valley Forge by his soldiers. And two lines from Cato, this play we've never heard of today, still resonate with us. One line is, one character in the play regrets that he has but only one life to give to Rome. And another character shouts, give me liberty or give me death.
This is Addison's play.
Addison's Cato, yes.
Addison's Cato, huh. And you talk about Washington you point out that you think a lot of historians have misunderstood Washington's military strategy, partly because they misunderstood the classical antecedents and Fabius and the model that he was using. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I think that's right. Oddly enough, each of my books seems to have a war at its center, even if it's not about war. And the American Revolution really is the heart of this book. Each of the characters goes through it, experiences in some form, takes away lessons from it. Washington is fascinating to me because he begins the war as a relatively young general. He's 43 at the time he's appointed command of the U.S. Army, a non-existent army. So he's relatively young for a commanding general, but he's also a pretty conventional officer. Washington begins the war pretty much like his British opposites. He believes in courage, honor, and the offensive. He's going to take the offensive in the war. He finds out pretty quickly the soldiers he has in the American army are not competent to take on British regulars on the open battlefield, where the British regulars, well drilled, can deliver volleys of fire followed up by ferocious bayonet charges. And at first, Washington's very unhappy with the soldiers, and he says they're dirty, they're undisciplined, they can't handle these British people. I wish I had better soldiers. And eventually he learns that to criticize a militiaman for not being like a British regular is like criticizing a saw for not being a hammer. They're different tools. You need to learn to use them. And Washington begins to change. And this is to his great credit. The hardest thing in warfare, I think, is for leaders to adjust, to recognize the situation and to adjust as needed. Washington does that. And he makes one change. He says, okay, this offensive stuff isn't working. I just got my butt kicked out of Long Island. I got chased across Manhattan, and then I got chased across New Jersey. And he says, I'm going to go to a defensive posture. I'm going to fight in a fortress. That doesn't work either. And finally, he moves, as you say, to the model of the Roman general Fabius, a Fabian form of warfare. And this is to basically refuse to give battle, to recognize that my force is not good at giving battle, but we're good at other things. And so, especially in New Jersey in the war, he says, let's not fight them, let's nibble on them. An army doesn't have to give battle every day, but soldiers have to eat every day. They're going to go out and look for food. When they go out in foraging parties, let's ambush them. When they go out and looking maybe to get a herd of cattle, let's ambush them. So attack their supply lines, attack their foraging parties. He's very unsuccessful in New York. As I said, he gets kicked out. In New Jersey, in just 6 months, they cut the British army in half through these daily raids. The British army just sort of fades away through prisoners, through casualties, through desertion. They demoralize the enemy. And that's how Washington keeps his force alive. But at the same time, he's never really a natural Fabian fighter. He wants to be an offensive general. And when the French finally come in and give him money and troops, and he has French ships offshore at Yorktown, he's able to resume the offensive, and he fights a fine offensive battle at Yorktown and basically wins the war.
I want to remind people you can type questions in the box at any time. We'll get to them in 10 or 15 minutes, but you can type them throughout the thing. One of the things, Tom, I was struck by is, I mean, we don't read the classics much anymore in school. And when we do, I mean, in school, at least I did, we tend to read the Greeks. You know, maybe we'll read a little Plato and Aristotle in college, and we'll read the tragedians in high school, Sophocles and Euripides. We don't read the Romans much, but you point out that the Romans were really more influential for most of the founders, at least, than the Greeks.
Yeah, it's one of the things that was hard for me to get my mind around was, as I researched the book, I came to realize that our ancient world is not the founders' ancient world. They have a very different conception. As you say, Rome was for them foremost. Greek was kind of off in the background. Greece was really the thing you might study in advanced studies. Everybody who went to high school and college would read the Romans, would know Latin. The advanced kids, the third and fourth years of college, would do Greek. And even then, they didn't do the tragedians. Almost nobody read the tragedians of Greece. That's really a 19th century, as you say, Greek revival. That comes out of Germany, out of Romanticism, the elevation of the great Greek dramatist. Nobody really read them except for Jefferson, especially among the founders. The foremost dramatist of the ancient world to the founding generation was Terence, a Roman comic playwright nobody reads today. And believe me, I tried.
Yeah.
I said, okay, if they read Terence, I'll go back and read Terence. And he's not really interesting. And partly, I'm sure, because I don't know what he's talking about. I don't know what the jokes are about. So their world was Rome, the Roman Republic. In the background, Sparta was much more important to them than Athens. Samuel Adams, John Adams' cousin, says at one point, I want Boston to become the Sparta of the New World. And Athens, which we tend to see as the foremost Greek city, the example we all look to, was seen by them as a little bit frivolous, unstable. One historian described it as like a ship without a captain. Of course, Thomas Jefferson, always the exception, likes the Greeks, focuses on the Greeks more than the Romans, focuses on Athens more than Sparta, and really, I think, is very forward-looking, more modern than the others in his focus on the Greeks and on Athens.
I find some, I haven't read a ton of them, but I find some of the, like Seneca, Cicero, to be kind of surprisingly accessible, actually. I mean, you think even sometimes more accessible than the secondary stuff about it. I wonder what you recommend for people who, who this is a little daunting, all these ancient thinkers. Who would you start with if somebody wants to dip into the Romans?
My answer might surprise you because I wouldn't have said it a few years ago. I would start with Montesquieu, 18th century French philosopher of the Enlightenment, because he's the bridge between the ancient world and the modern world. Montesquieu studies the Romans. His first great book is about the Roman Republic, and even his masterpiece, The Spirit of Laws, at least a third of it is about Roman history. Montesquieu uses Roman history to invent modern liberal democracy. All the characteristics that we associate with sort of the modern governments of England, France, the United States, which is democracy, tolerance of an opposition, encouragement of an opposition, a belief in trying to balance liberty and order, to balance justice and the organization of society, the rights of the individual versus the needs of the group. All of this comes out of Montesquieu, and Montesquieu is pulling it out of his understanding of Roman history.
Interesting. Let me ask a little bit about the misuse of ancient examples, we see white supremacists sometimes drawing on, like at Charlottesville, they were carrying flags with symbols of the Roman Empire. I'm not sure if there were flags like that on the January 6th riots, and there have even, I don't know if you saw, there's a story in the New York Times Magazine the other day about a professor at Princeton who argues that the classics are intertwined, inextricably linked with white supremacy at the core. And so I wanted to ask, I guess, a two-part question. One, what is it about the Romans that appeals to these people, to white supremacists? And is there anything to the argument of this Princeton professor and others who say these are two things that are inextricably linked in some fundamental way?
There's no question that the Constitution writes into our basic law the fact of slavery. And anybody who thinks so simply is not reading the Constitution correctly. The founders, in putting together the Constitution, accepted the fact of slavery, partly because if you read the Constitution as a peace pact between the states, they were trying to figure out a way to hold the Union together. And the delegation from Georgia and South Carolina going into the Constitutional Convention said, if there's a whiff of abolishing slavery in this thing, we will walk. And that's important, not because South Carolina and Georgia were big states, but because if they were outside the United States, they would need foreign aid to exist. And that would bring in the European powers again. So they're desperate, as they write the Constitution, to balance between having the Union and the need to legitimate slavery. So they did. And slavery is not a stain on the American fabric. It is woven into the American fabric. It is part of how this country was organized. The Constitution, I think, lights the fuse for the Civil War. And after the Civil War, you have Reconstruction. And I think we are still in Reconstruction. Now, to the point of the white supremacist misusing history, absolutely. one of the justifications that the slave power offers in American debates in the 19th century is, well, the ancient world had slavery too. The difference they ignore is that in the ancient world, slavery was very different. First and foremost, ancient slavery in Greece and Rome was not race-based. American slavery was race-based and is associated with race to the point at which the Dred Scott decision says Black Americans, enslaved or not, can never be citizens, and they have no rights that the white people must respect. Ancient slavery was very different, with the exception of a place like Sparta, where slavery is very harsh. Roman and Greek slavery was not as harsh as American chattel slavery. Slaves enjoyed some rights. Foremost, the offspring of slaves who were freed could hold political office. You didn't have Black Americans in great numbers holding office in this country, with the exception of a short period after the Civil War, until the late 1960s, when Black people in the South can begin to vote. So ancient slavery is not race-based, it's not as harsh. In fact, the word slave comes from Slav, which we associate with the Slavs, the Slavic people, who we would call Caucasian. But this is distorted in American history, and I think distorted in the American understanding even now. One of the really striking things to me about the hard white supremacists is they really don't know their ancient history.
I want to ask also about elitism and classicism. You write about this a little bit in your book, that one of the great ironies of the American Revolution is it was a revolution led largely by aristocrats, or the founders, many of them were aristocrats, but it was a revolution that ended up destroying aristocracy as a social system. And I'm just, did classicism, did it engender elitism or populism? Seems a little of both.
Classicism gave them their vocabulary. The people who made the revolution had this vocabulary that they basically draw from Rome. Why? Because they didn't have a lot of other examples. Most governments historically or in history had been monarchies or tyrannies. They knew they did not want to have a monarchy, with the exception of Hamilton, who shows up at the Constitutional Convention and says, oh, you basically want a presidency for life, a Senate for life, and then he leaves. But everybody else says, no, we actually want a republic. And they don't have a lot of examples to look to. What they have is a few Greek city-states, a couple of modern examples, and the Roman Republic. So that's what they look to. And they say, we want power to the people. Well, they get it with a vengeance. Gordon Woods, one of the great American historians of American history, says the revolution succeeded much better than the people who ran the revolution expected it to, and they were a little bit sort of run over by the revolution they unleashed. When they say power to the people believe them. When they write at the beginning of the Constitution, we the people take that ball and run with it. And they kind of run right over people like Adams, and even at the end, Jefferson. The American people say, hey, it's no longer about elite culture. It's about what we want. And that is a revolutionary thing. The American people wind up saying, okay, we're going to put away your elite culture, your classical culture. We are going to make the decisions, the people will. And you get this really radical change in American religion from the revolutionary generation not being very Christian at all in their views, to a real resurgence of Christianity and of Protestantism and of evangelical Protestantism in the early 19th century, coupled with a market revolution. The American people like the market, and they like having their own religion. And they start shimmering off into all these different cults and views and Protestant, churches of different kinds, because the American people are saying, hey, we're in charge. And I think it's a wonderful thing, but it's a little bit scary, especially to the Federalists like John Adams, which is one reason John Adams has such a terrible presidency. He, frankly, is freaked out by the people taking power, by the people emerging. You have political newspapers emerging in the 1790s and he hates being criticized by newspapers. He thinks it's illegal to criticize the president, and he starts throwing newspaper editors in jail.
Let me just follow up on that point too about you were talking about Christianity and the rise of evangelicalism. What about the role of Christianity during this founding period as well? Because there's certainly a Christian cultural influence from the Puritans and ideas like, I think of like the city on the hill, that the concept of kind of the chosenness that is the foundation of American exceptionalism. Where does Christianity fit into the founders' worldview? And how?
It's there, but I would say it's kind of in the back row, uh, especially in our two foundational documents, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. Uh, at a time when some of the state constitutions explicitly say you must be a Christian, you must swear to Christianity in order to hold office, none of that is in the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution. There's not a whole lot of God in the Declaration. I would argue the Declaration of Independence is more an Epicurean document after the Greek philosopher Epicurus than it is a Christian document. Jefferson is very influenced by Epicurus. He writes later in life, I am an Epicurean. Epicurus is the philosopher who says the aim of life should be the avoidance of pain and the pursuit of happiness. Mm. And Jefferson is very much about that, even when it's irrational, even when it privileges the heart above the head. And this is interesting, coming out of the age of reason, out of the Enlightenment. It's saying, no, reason isn't everything. Sometimes the heart is important too. And this is important for Jefferson, not only in his intellectual life, but also in his romantic life. He constantly is pursuing married women because I think married women for him are the embodiment of Epicurean life. It has all the prospects of romance, but none of the risk of long-term entanglements.
Right. And the flip side, though, also is another major influence, aside from the Epicureans, were the Stoics, who are very much about reason, and Seneca and Marcus Aurelius. Can you talk a little bit about the Stoic worldview and how that influenced the founders?
Yeah, I think the Declaration tends to make us look too much to Greece because Jefferson looks to Greece. You're right. The vast majority of the revolutionary generation look much more to the Stoics and to Stoic thinkers. Cato is Stoic in his approach. Cicero, an incredibly important statesman to them, especially to John Adams. I would say Cicero is kind of a Stoic wannabe, more an admirer of Stoicism than a practitioner of it. But Cicero writes a lot about Stoicism, about reason, about frugality, wisdom, about pursuing the public life and burying self-interest. And then kind of in the middle of all that, this is what I love about Madison. Madison comes along and blows a whistle like a referee at a football game. It says timeout. All this stuff about virtue, public-mindedness, it ain't working. And it's interesting. I think Washington, we know, agrees with this. Washington has seen during the Revolution reliance on public virtue, on people being public spirited. He says at one point, is not going to win this war for us. That we have to look to self-interest. And Madison comes along and says, that's right. Madison knows the classical world better than anybody else, basically. At the time of the writing of the Constitution, he has spent 4 years reading literally trunkloads of books about the classical world that he has had Jefferson shipped to him from Europe. And he arrives at the Constitutional Convention steeped in ancient political history and political philosophy. And he has one single point he impresses on the convention. Reliance on virtue isn't working. Instead of having that, let's pitch interest against interest, ambition against ambition. Let us have a country so big, with power dispersed so greatly, the only way to make a way forward is to be able to cut deals, to form alliances, to find compromises. And this is Madison's, I think, wonderful contribution to the structuring of America. Power is dispersed between the states and the federal government, within the federal government in 3 different branches, within the legislative branch between 2 houses. And he says, if you're going to go anywhere, you're going to have to learn to live with each other, to make deals. And I think Madison would say, when we worry about gridlock these days, he said, that's not a bug, that's a feature. We design that into it. If you people can't find a way to form a majority, nothing's going to happen.
Hmm. All right. Well, it's about 1:30. Why don't we turn to questions? We've got some questions here. A good one from Rebecca Wayland. She says, "I really appreciated learning about the influence of the Scottish Enlightenment, and I did too. And you wrote a lot about the Scottish Enlightenment in your book. And Rebecca asks, can you talk about that, and in particular, how it related to the ebbs and flows of classical influence?"
I actually, you know how they have director's cuts of movies these days? I sort of fantasize about there being an author's cut for a book. Yeah, I wrote a lot about the Scottish Enlightenment in this book,
Yeah.
but I wrote twice as much as anybody got to see.
Right.
Because my editor said, Tom, all the Scottish Enlightenment stuff is fascinating, but it really is a sidelight to your theme. It's how a lot of this stuff got to America, especially how the Scottish Enlightenment got to America, which was basically through the tobacco trade. Tobacco ships going between Glasgow and Virginia became an easy way for poor young Scotsmen to get to America. And so these young graduates of Edinburgh and Glasgow and St. Andrews come to America and become tutors to people like Jefferson and Madison. But a lot of it wound up on the cutting room floor. I was fascinated by the tobacco trade. The Scots really invented the modern world. There's a book by Arthur Herman about that, how the Scots invented the modern world. The Scots invent the Industrial Revolution, beginning with the steam engine, James Watt in Glasgow. They also invent modern banking. They invent like the branch system. They invent new forms of credit. They invent a much more streamlined version of the tobacco industry than the English had. And in just 50 years, they come to dominate the tobacco trade as over the English. More tobacco from Virginia is imported to Scotland and then re-exported to France, Scandinavia, Holland, Russia, then goes into the English ports. They also invent, among other things, demography, economics, modern economics with Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations, modern history with Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. And I was fascinated by this. They invent geology. Why is geology significant? It really was like a light bulb going on over my head. The Scots invent geology as a leap of the imagination. James Hutton says, what if the world is not 6,000 years old, as the church has taught? What if it is millions upon millions of years old? And you start thinking differently about time, about formation of mountains. And then a few decades later, Darwin comes along and says, if you take Adam Smith's thinking about the free market, and you take Hutton's thinking about a vast time, you can invent evolution and say, oh, that's how species come to have their origins and come to develop. So I'm fascinated that, first of all, the Scottish Enlightenment is just such this intellectual bomb that invents the modern world. And second, was much more influential in the shaping of America than anything that happened in England. It's really the French Enlightenment and the Scottish Enlightenment that form modern America. And the connection is Montesquieu is hugely influential in Scotland. And the Scots are, a lot of them, still educated in France rather than England. Scottish law is based on Roman law in a way that English law is not. Scottish law relies a lot on Justinian's Codex, the great compilation of Roman law. And Montesquieu is very important in how they come to think about Roman law and apply it. All that comes to America through the tobacco trade. James Madison, most notably, goes to Princeton, then called the College of New Jersey. The president of Princeton is this fascinating figure, James Witherspoon. Witherspoon is the only foreigner to run an American college at the time, first one ever. He comes from Scotland. And he teaches in his lectures on moral philosophy things like checks and balances. We know from lecture notes that students took, he talked about checks and balances. Young Jimmy Madison, or Jemmy as they called him, young Jemmy writes this stuff down, and suddenly that becomes the basis of the American Constitution.
It sounds like maybe you have a sequel here. How the Scottish Enlightenment invented the mind. If there's that much on the cutting room floor, I mean, interesting stuff.
Yeah, there should be an appendix of all the stuff that I couldn't publish.
Right. Brad Newman has a good question about the concept of virtue, which the Roman concept of virtue that you write a lot about in the book. He says in the book, you talk about the classical definition of virtue and its profound influence on the founding fathers, including Washington. What writings or historical examples specifically do you think drove home the importance of virtue to the founding fathers?
That's a good question. You kind of stumped the chump here. When I think of what they all talk about virtue. I note in the book that the founding fathers collectively mentioned virtue, I think, twice as much as they talk about freedom or liberty. But I can't think of any one source for virtue. It's more just the value they take away, that the public man, to use their words of their time, the public man is a man of virtue who puts the public good before his own. It's a very simple formulation, and to them, that's basically what you should be. It's what they all strive for. It's what they admire Washington for reaching, and kind of what they despise Aaron Burr for not caring about. Burr doesn't care about virtue, and they're kind of stunned by this guy Burr. He really is out in for himself, and they don't understand him. He's almost of a different world. But what the source is for, I don't know if there's a single source for this, what they take away from virtue. It was like asking, what's the source for oxygen? It was all around them.
You mentioned Burr, the Cataline conspiracy is something that was often mentioned or occasionally mentioned in connection with Burr. What was that, and how that comes up a lot in the founding generation? What was that, and how did it? What lessons did they take from it?
I think we kind of probably have a distorted view of the Cataline conspiracy. This is a conspiracy against the Roman Republic, and Cicero's fight against the Cataline conspiracy is Cicero's great moment in Roman history. His 4 denunciations of this conspiracy, which was basically a kind of aristocratic alliance with populism to bring down the Republic, supposedly to inspire a slave revolt and to burn the city and attack the aristocrats. So it is put down under Cicero's control. Some of the leaders are executed, and then the Romans go out, they fight a battle with Catiline and utterly defeat it. It came away as the worst thing you can call somebody in revolutionary America, a Catiline, somebody who puts his own interest before the interest of the public, and also somebody who's kind of sleazy. They described Catiline as a man of low morals, kind of hanging around with the wrong sort of people. Catiline, for his part, attacked Cicero as a bit of a new man, a foreigner. Cicero came from outside the city, from south of Rome, and was really not from a leading family. I think Catiline probably gets a bit of a bad rap, but for the importance of our talk here, he was the worst thing you could be in the eyes of the revolutionary generation. And to them, Aaron Burr becomes the Catiline. This is an ironic point in American history, the election of 1800. Alexander Hamilton kind of swallows and says, I will support Thomas Jefferson over Burr. Not that I like Jefferson, not that I trust Jefferson, but I sure trust him a whole lot than I ever would trust Aaron Burr. And indeed, 6 years later, Aaron Burr is indicted for treason. He wins the court fight, partly because it's a political put-up job by Thomas Jefferson. They don't have a lot of evidence. But Burr, and of course, I forgot to mention also, as the sitting vice president kills Alexander Hamilton, one of the leading figures of the time, who effectively had served as Washington's prime minister.
We have a bunch of questions about education and the role of history in education. Somebody asks, given the limited time and resources devoted to U.S. history in our public schools, how would you advise educators designing and redesigning the history curriculum?
I would ask them, students, to write their own Declaration of Independence. The great thing about the Declaration of Independence, it's a statement of who we are, what we want to be, and aspirations are important. America is a country that has a very mixed historical record, yet remains a great country, I think, because of the aspirations, the idea that all people are created equal and all people deserve equal justice before the law. But the Declaration of Independence also is an indictment of the king. It's a list of grievances for what he has done wrong. This is not an idea original to me. I was really struck that at the freedom schools, the civil rights movement ran in Mississippi in the summer of 1964. One of the things they had students do was write their own Declaration of Independence. What do you want to be? What is your sense of who you are? And what are your grievances against the state of Mississippi? And the grievances, these 8th, 9th, and 10th graders who had gone to not very good schools in rural Mississippi were just strikingly on point. We are not taught the skills we need to learn. For example, there were no teaching of foreign languages to Black students in Mississippi in 1964. A lot of them wanted to learn French or Spanish simply to show that they could learn a foreign language. It's striking that how quickly they were able to take on the Declaration of Independence and make it their own. I think you've seen right now in America a lot of people who lack an appreciation of what this country is, what it's supposed to be, how it's supposed to work. I think the people who invaded the Capitol building on January 6th had no conception of the history of the Constitution, what it is, how it's supposed to work. One of the things that really strikes me about the Constitution, it was written in part in reaction to a domestic insurrection, Shays' Rebellion. And Madison and other people thought we really need a stronger central government. And that's why you have
John Jay too. I should add.
Yes, I'm sorry. Yes,
of John Jay.
Shout out to John Jay too. And Jay is actually part of that conversation about what are we going to do about Shays' Rebellion? And that's why you wind up with that phrase in the Constitution, to ensure domestic tranquility. Because the Articles of Confederation government that had been in power during the 1780s had been unable to ensure domestic tranquility. And they said, we want a central government that is able to step in when needed.
We have a question from an anonymous attendee from the other end of the political spectrum. It sounds like this person asks, you mentioned how democracy can devolve into mob rule. You were just talking a little bit about that, the Shays' Rebellion. This person says, please comment on today's cancel culture taking place in our universities, social media, and our national press. What would the founders have thought about that?
I don't know what the founders would have said. I would say it's about accountability and consequences. And it's about a changing country and a changing definition. Black people in this country have only recently begin to even hope for equal justice before the law. And there are still people in this country, some of them wearing police uniforms, who do not provide equal justice before the law. So when I hear buzz phrases like cancel culture, I think they tend to be negligent about American history. What would the founders say about where we are now? First of all, I think they would be really embarrassed at what a mess they made of slavery and how it's still, the after effects of slavery still are a major part of discourse and problems in this country. The second thing I'd say is they would point the finger at us. And they'd say, look, we designed the Constitution to be amended. That's why they're called amendments, betterments. And the first half of American history so far, there were a lot of amendments that changed the Constitution. In the second half, there haven't been. We really have not made a lot of changes. They'd say, why haven't you kept the Constitution a living document? For example, one of the things that I like that have been discussed is, should the Supreme Court have terms of 18 years? You get an appointment for 18 years and that's it. That would, among other things, get the Supreme Court out of the presidential political debates every 4 years. There were different ways of organizing this. I think the founders also would say the two things that brought down the Roman Republic in their view were corruption and faction. And they would say the way you people are running your campaigns these days, political campaigns, meets our definition of corruption. When money is more important than votes, that's not what we designed. In fact, that's oligarchy. We did not design this country to be an oligarchy. We designed it to be a democratic republic. Yes, a republic, not just a democracy, but a democratic republic. And so I think they would say, yeah, some hits on us, but you people really need to pull up your socks and do a better job working with the Constitution.
Right, and you have toward the end of the book some I guess prescriptions, I would call them, things that you would apply some of these ideas to current events, and you talk a little bit about public health. But how else, aside from the ways that you were talking about, how else can we restore this concept of the public good, public virtue, or is it impossible?
I don't think it's impossible. As I mentioned, one of the things is I think the founders would have said Citizens United was a crazy decision. That number one, corporations are not people. This is an invention of the 19th century Supreme Court, and the corporations do not have all the rights of people, and they especially do not have the political rights of people, and that you cannot allow corporations and other large groups of wealth holders to dominate your politics, that is not the system we designed. I think most of all, they would refer us to the Constitution. Twice the phrase appears, the common defense, and what is it? The common defense of the public welfare, or the Commonwealth. Is it Commonwealth? I can't remember. The point is, we don't talk enough about the public good. We talk a lot about the market and what the market wants and what the market dictates, but there are goods that are more important than the market. Goods, education, infrastructure, public safety, and the glaring example of the last year, public health. Public health is a common good. To have it, you need an effective government that believes in the efficacy of government and operates effectively. Instead, what we had in the last year was really an Articles of Confederation government, a weak central government that basically tells the governors, you figure it out. And we have this experiment. What happens with an epidemic or a pandemic with the Articles of Confederation government? It essentially creates a free market for viruses. We don't want a free market for viruses. We want to stop it.
All right, we've got 5 or 10 minutes left, so I would encourage you, if you've got a question, ask it now, or you're going to be out of luck. Not all of the founders were classicists necessarily. There are some in fact who disdained the classics openly. I think Thomas Paine, beautiful writer, I think he was one of those who was not a huge fan of the classics, or set me straight.
No, you're absolutely right. Thomas Paine, I think, is probably the most neglected because he's a public intellectual at a time when they don't have a word for that or a place for that. He's an outrider. The other guys, Jefferson, Adams, these were doers. And in fact, Washington is much more a man of deeds than of words. But they weren't playing with philosophy simply to think about it. They were trying to design a government. They were trying to run things. They were politicians and statesmen. Thomas Paine is such an outrider, as you say, a terrific writer, incredibly influential in shaping the mood of the revolution, yet not really credited for the role he plays. And also, as you say, not a big fan of the classics. He was tired of the classics. He is really anticipating what happens in the 1790s and the 1810s and 20s. Put those things aside. Let's talk about the country we have now. And what you see very quickly, influenced by Paine, they don't need Cato anymore. They have their own heroes. They have Washington. They have Lafayette. They have Ethan Allen. They have populist American heroes. And so it's the picture of Washington they put up on the wall. It's Washington's farewell address they teach in their schools. You don't need to teach Cicero anymore if you have Washington. if you have the Federalist Papers, if you have Madison. And so things change very quickly. And the classics really go out the door. And it's not a terrible thing they do. The classics were a bridge to what made America, and they're still in the background. It would be good if people appreciated that we take our vocabulary, the Capitol building, the Senate. These are all things. The names are our political parties. Democrat is a Greek word, Republican is a Latin word. That these are all in the background. If we appreciated them more, we'd have a better understanding of where we came from. At the same time, I can't criticize the 19th century Americans for saying, we don't need that stuff anymore. We have our own country, our own history, and let's study that.
And also, you point out that society was changing, and part of the reason people weren't reading the classics anymore is because nobody had time. Because with the Industrial Revolution, there were so many other things to study, and we see that right up to the present day. All of a sudden, people were studying economics, and people were studying science, and priorities changed.
And it's important to remember that one reason people like Thomas Jefferson could sit around and philosophize is because they were living off the sweat of captive human beings who they kept in their basements. Mm. They lived off the artificial luxury of enslaving human beings.
Right.
And a lot of Americans, Abraham Lincoln, were working real hard in the 19th century. Now, Lincoln reads a lot, but he reads Shakespeare and the Bible, and he reads the newspapers. And that's very 19th century American. And I really don't have a complaint with it. I just wish people understood more what was in the background that enabled us to get to that.
Right. I thought it was interesting. Also, you write a little bit about language and Noah Webster and how the changing nature of the word virtue. It's come in our own time to mean chastity. We think of it, but it was different. Can you talk a little bit about Webster and language?
It's funny, language is almost the fallback position of the Federalist. Noah Webster is very much a Federalist. In fact, before he wrote a dictionary, he was a Federalist newspaper editor. He comes out, and I think the view of historians of language is the Federalists realize they've lost the argument. The Jeffersonian democracy is going to run America in the 19th century. They still hold on to some of the judiciary, but beyond that, not much. The fallback position of the Federalist is, well, if we can't control the people, at least we can control the language. And Webster writes his dictionary in part to say, okay, this is what the American language is going to be. This is how you're going to talk about things. He gives his definitions. But even when Webster defines virtue, he gives some definitions, and he says, it used to mean public-mindedness, but nobody talks about that anymore.
Hmm. Bob Morrow has a question about the democratization of the media. He asks, how does democracy in the age of internet mobs avoid autocracy?
I don't think it's that different, honestly. In the 1790s, political newspapers emerged in this country. You had newspapers before then, but they were basically the shipping news, the foreign news bought by ships. Political newspapers start growing in the 1790s, partly as the vehicle for political parties. Nobody knows what these things are. Nobody wants to be found guilty of factionalism, but political parties are emerging. The Jeffersonian Democrats with Madison and the Federalist with Adams and Hamilton. Those newspapers of the 1790s were every bit as disruptive as social media are today. The evidence for this is the newspapers start coming out talking about different sorts of politics and attacking the president, which shocks Adams. At one point, Adams goes home for 7 months in a sulk and basically says, I'm not going to run the American government if people are going to criticize me. I didn't sign up for that. Within 10 years, the opposition wins the presidency as a result of this disruptive new media, the political newspaper. So I think disruption was very powerful then. I'm very critical of Jefferson in the book, but I got to say, one of the great things about Jefferson, in his first inaugural address, he gets up and he says two things in 1800. He says, number one, all differences of opinion are not differences of principle. Important distinction to make. Second thing he says is, and I'm not going to throw the opposition in jail like Adams did. Now, John Adams, interesting for our time, is our first one-term president. He's bitter, he's unhappy, he's shocked that he has been turned out of office. He's painfully aware that he is the first American president not to be reelected. And in fact, he doesn't show up and attend Jefferson's inaugural. He leaves town. Kind of like somebody else did recently.
Right. I cannot believe that it is 7 o'clock. And that was the fastest hour that I think we've had. So interesting, Tom. We do try to keep these to an hour. I could ask you questions all night, but I might just end by asking, 180 some years ago, Alexis de Tocqueville said, Americans don't like to read about the classical past. They like to read about themselves. And the conventional wisdom is that's still true. We still like to read about ourselves. What is this book that you wrote was a huge bestseller? What is it about this topic that you think struck such a nerve with people?
I don't know. I've genuinely puzzled myself. I did not think it would be a bestseller. I think part of it is the wisdom of my book editor, Jonathan Zhao at HarperCollins, who said, I'm going to put this book out the week after the presidential election. And I said, why? He said, because people are going to be sick of politics, but interested in American political history. And he said, they're going to be asking fundamental questions. Your book is about fundamental questions. Who are we? What are we supposed to be? How are we supposed to do this thing? I got to mention, though, de Tocqueville failed classics. Literally.
What's that?
De Tocqueville failed classics.
Oh, okay. All right. So what does he know? He
knew a lot more about America than he knew about the classics.
Right. Thanks so much, Tom. That was fascinating. And I hope you will come visit us in Rye on your next trip through New York and see some of the classical details and influence at the J Estate.
Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks, Tom. Good night, everybody.